Well, good morning. I wanted to start off today by sharing something with you that could be called a classic, maybe even vintage, and it is the TV Guide. Let me show this up here for you guys. So I don't know how many of you remember the TV Guide. I did find out this week they still make the TV Guide magazine, but they're very rare. I couldn't actually get my hands on a physical copy of it, so we had to deal digital. But the TV Guide was the thing that we used to know what was on television before there was Netflix and the internet. And I know for me as a kid, it showed me all of the things that are going to be shown on all 5 of the stations that came into my house. And I used it religiously. Now, for me, the biggest thing was using it for Saturday morning cartoons. How many of you remember Saturday morning cartoons? What were some of your favorites? Holler them out to me. Bugs Bunny. I got several of those in first service. Smurfs, all right, yeah. And, I was big on Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Loved He-Man. I loved the Thundercats. And then for a short amount of time, there's this really cool thing called Hulk Hogan's Rock and Wrestling, where the WWF wrestlers were cartoons who were in a rock band. I don't know why that happened, but it was super cool. But what I would do is I would get that TV Guide, and I would sit down with it, and whenever they came out with a new lineup of Saturday morning cartoons, I'd map out which ones I was going to watch on which station. I'm gonna make a chart and a diagram because I didn't want to miss the good stuff. But then I didn't just use it for Saturday mornings. Also, when I got off the bus on school days in the afternoon, I had to make sure I didn't miss those reruns. Who doesn't want to watch another episode of MASH and Andy Griffith, right? And then I also needed to know when the game shows would be on, because you didn't want to miss Jeopardy, you didn't want to miss Wheel of Fortune. And then there was the sitcoms and the dramas on prime time. There was Friday night movies back in our day. That was the only way you got to watch movies. And then there was, of course, late night talk shows and Saturday night main events and all sorts of things that you had to make sure you mapped out. And so for me, I would take that TV Guide and it would predict what I was going to do with my time. Everything else was scheduled around the TV Guide. Like it mandated, dictated what I did. And I might even go this far as to say it was kind of like a god to me. And I know that might sound kind of extreme, but it impacted what I did. It challenged, it impacted what I believed. It informed how I saw the world. And isn't that what a God is supposed to do for us? We started out last week in this series by saying that true worship requires an undivided heart. And we looked at King Solomon. And King Solomon, although at the beginning of his life it said he loved the Lord, by the end of his life it said he also loved foreign women, and they led him to worship a lot of false gods, false idols. Then what we find out, if you continue reading that story, is after Solomon dies, his son Rehoboam becomes king, and not only does he have a divided heart, but he makes decisions that result in a divided kingdom. See, Rehoboam decided as a young man, prideful, full of himself, that he was going to rule with a heavy hand, and it caused a rebellion that was actually led by Jeroboam, who was one of his father Solomon's officials. And Jeroboam, and this was predicted, God had told Jeroboam this was going to happen, he used Jeroboam to lead the majority of the Israelite nation to become their own kingdom, the northern kingdom of 10 tribes that they then just called themselves Israel. And Rehoboam was left to be king only over one southern kingdom of Judah. But the thing is Jeroboam also wasn't that great of a guy. And he also made a lot of bad decisions that divided his heart and divided his people's attention. And so there was also a prophecy against Jeroboam. And this will be on the screen for you, but in 1 Kings chapter 14, this is what it says. Go tell Jeroboam, this is what the Lord God of Israel says. I raised you up from among the people. I appointed you ruler over my people Israel, tore the kingdom away from the house of David and gave it to you. But you are not like my servant David, who kept my commands and followed me with all his heart, doing only what is right in my sight. You behaved more wickedly than all who were before you. In order to anger me, you have proceeded to make for yourselves other gods and cast images, but you have flung me behind your back. Because of all this, I'm about to bring disaster on the house of Jeroboam. And it says there's going to be a kingdom from beyond the Euphrates that would one day come and take over Jeroboam's kingdom. And that future disaster was all going to be because they had made false gods and forsaken true worship of the one true God who we've learned today. His name is Yahweh. But today we're going to jump forward to 2 Kings chapter 17. So if you want to find that, that's where we'll spend most of our time. And what we're going to see in 2 Kings 7:17 is the fulfillment of those words that were said to Jeroboam. 200 years later, 17 kings later, God didn't forget. He fulfills what he promised. We find this here in 2 Kings chapter 17, starting in verse 1. It says, in the 12th year of Judah, that southern kingdom's king Ahaz, Hoshea, son of Elah, became king over Israel and Samaria, that northern kingdom, Samaria being the capital city. And he reigned 9 years. He did what was evil in the Lord's sight, but not like the kings of Israel who preceded him. King Shalmaneser of Assyria attacked him, and Hoshea became his vassal and paid him tribute. But the king of Assyria caught Hoshea in a conspiracy. He had sent envoys to So, king of Egypt, and had not paid tribute to the king of Assyria as in previous years. Therefore, the king of Assyria arrested him and put him in prison. The king of Assyria invaded the whole land, marched up to Samaria, and besieged it for 3 years. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria. He deported the Israelites to Assyria and settled them in Hala, along the Habor-Gozan's river, and in the cities of the Medes. Now, Hoshea becomes this king of Israel. He's many, many generations after Jeroboam. And Hoshea is not one of my favorite kings. Because what did it say that Hoshea did? He did evil in the sight of the Lord. Just like Janice said, we see this pattern in their lives, right? And so he did evil in the sight of the Lord. And because of that, God sends this foreign army, the Assyrians, to come in and occupy them. And for a time, Hoshea says, okay, I'll pay you tribute, and you'll be over us, but we'll still maintain our kingdom. But then he kind of gets greedy, and he kind of gets a little bit like full of himself, and he decides he's going to start a conspiracy, and he's going to defeat Assyria with his friends the Egyptians. Well, Assyria is much too strong for that. And so the king of Assyria comes in and attacks, and in 722 BC, we can study this in history, Assyria comes in and conquers Samaria and takes over the land of Israel. Hoshea becomes the very last king of that northern kingdom. There's no more kings of Israel. And those tribes are taken and they're scattered all over the world to all these other places that Assyria has already conquered, never to fully return. It's the end of this cycle for Israel. Now, thankfully, God has preserved Judah in the southern kingdom, but they're all that remains. It's really a tragic, heartbreaking moment in the history of Israel and God's people. And why did it happen? Verse 7. This disaster happened because the people of Israel sinned against the Lord their God. This happened because of sin. The Lord their God, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt from the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and because they worshipped other gods. When we give our heart and our lives to things that are not the Lord, there's going to be consequences. There's going to be things that happen that are not best for us and for those around us. And in particular, right here it says that Israel's sin was ignoring the love and faithfulness of the one true God who delivered them from Egypt. They forgot that Yahweh was the lawgiver and the promise keeper, and that he alone was the one who could sustain them. And they gave their hearts to false idols and manufactured gods. And God had warned them about that. He told them, he said, when you get into the promised land and you have all that you need, you're going to be tempted to serve other things. He says, don't do that. God had originally warned them of that through Moses in Leviticus, where he told them, do not turn to worthless idols or make cast images of gods for yourselves. I am the Lord your God. Moses had also warned them that if they did do that, this is what would happen. It says that you have provoked God's jealousy with what is not a God. They've enraged me with their worthless idols, so I will provoke their jealousy with what is not a people. I will enrage them with a foolish nation. God used this foreign army of Assyria to get Israel's attention. More recently, the prophet Samuel had warned them. He says, don't turn away to follow worthless things that can't profit or rescue you. They are worthless. So God, the one true God, who'd done so many miraculous things, who'd taken them out of Egypt through the plagues, who'd parted the Red Seas, who'd kept them alive in the wilderness, who established them in a promised land, who'd given them a kingdom and a reign and a power. Like, how could this happen that they would forget what God had done for them? Well, it's because they had absorbed the culture around them. Let's read on here in verse 8. It says, they lived according to the customs of the nations that the Lord had dispossessed before the Israelites, and according to what the kings of Israel did. The Israelites secretly did things against the Lord their God that were not right. Did you know God knows the secret things that we do? They built high places in all their towns, from watchtower to fortified city. They set up for themselves sacred pillars and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every green tree. They burned incense there on all the high places, just like the nations that the Lord had driven out before them had done. They did evil things, angering the Lord. They served idols, although the Lord had told them, "You must not do this." Still, the Lord warned Israel and Judah through every prophet and every seer, saying, "Turn from your evil ways and keep my commands and statutes according to the whole law I commanded your ancestors and sent to you through my servants the prophets." And here's the good news of this, is that even though for generations they had turned their hearts to other things, and they had divided hearts, and they worshiped things that were not truly God, God kept over and over again saying, "I'm willing to forgive you. I'm willing to restore you. I'm willing to redeem this if you'll just turn back and trust me and listen to me." And isn't God good that he keeps doing that for us over and over and over again, even though we have a pattern of having divided hearts? But verse 14, they would not listen. Isn't that tragic? Instead, they became obstinate like their ancestors who did not believe the Lord their God. They rejected his statutes and his covenant he had made with their ancestors and the warnings he had given them. Here it is. They followed worthless idols and became worthless themselves, following the surrounding nations the Lord had commanded them not to imitate. They absorbed the culture. And when we serve the idols of our culture, God says we become worthless too. We become worthless, just like the things that we worship and serve, if we worship false things. We'll jump into verse 21. And they confirm here that this is fulfillment of God's words to Jeroboam. It says, "When the Lord tore Israel from the house of David, Israel made Jeroboam son of Nebat king. Then Jeroboam led Israel away from following the Lord and caused them to commit grave sin. The Israelites persisted in all the sins that Jeroboam committed and did not turn away from them. Finally, the Lord removed Israel from his presence, just as he had declared through all his servants the prophets. So Israel has been exiled to Assyria from their homeland to this very day." That exile was permanent for those northern kingdoms of Israel. And so in that moment, as the king of Assyria takes the Israelites and takes them all these foreign lands, he then flip-flops that and brings people from foreign lands to settle there in what is now known as Samaria. And it becomes this mixing pot of cultures and people, and it results in that mixed race that we see in the New Testament called Samaritans that all the Jewish people hated. All the way up until Jesus, right? Because Jesus loved everybody, and he loved the Samaritans, and he turned our thinking about that. But what these Samaritans did is what most people did when they were deported from their nation to a new nation in those days, is they collected all their carved images and all their household idols and all their false gods, and they put all those in their suitcase, and they took their trip, and they show up in a new land, and they get those out, and they put them up on their mantle, and they say, "Hey, I wonder if there's any new gods in this land that we can add to all the gods we already have." And so when they showed up in Samaria, northern Israel, they asked that, guess who the God was that they found? Yahweh, the true God, the one God of the whole world, the God of the Hebrews. And so they said, "Oh, great, well, we want to worship Yahweh too, and so we're just going to bring Yahweh, and we're going to put him up here with all these other idols we have." And so they went so far as to get a priest to come in and teach them how to worship God. And listen to what happens, verse 29, if you'll jump there with me. It says, "But the people of each nation were still making their own gods in the cities where they lived, and putting them in the shrines of the high places that the people of Samaria had made. The men of Babylon made Succoth-Benoth, the men of Cuth made Nergal, the men of Hamath made Ashima, the Avites made Nebhaz and Tartak, and the Sephirites burned their children in the fire to Adrimelech and Animelech, the gods of Sepharim. They feared the Lord, but they also made from their ranks priests for the high places who were working for them at the shrines of the high places. They feared the Lord, but they also worshiped their own gods according to the practices of the nations from which they had been deported." They tried to worship God, but they kept worshiping other things too. They had a divided heart. You know, and what they miss is what we talked about last week, is that Yahweh is the only true God and that he demands exclusive worship. But what were they doing? And this is so significant, I think. They were making their own gods. Think about that for a minute. If you or I went out today and we were woodworkers and we made some really cool thing out of wood and we made that, and then we looked at it and said, you know, that looks so good, I think I'm going to worship that like a god. That doesn't make any sense, does it? But that's what they did. They made their own gods. And as we look at their gods, not only are they silly, but they're kind of horrible, aren't they? You know, and to worship their gods, they did things like worshiping the dead. They included sexual acts in their worship. And it even says that they burned their own children in the fire to worship these false gods that they had made themselves. It's crazy. But are there things in our life that divide our heart and divide our attention? Are there things in our culture that we absorb sometimes and that we worship right alongside God? You know, current statistics tell us, thankfully, that the majority of Americans still say that they believe in a God. Maybe not the God, but a God. Actually, 2/3 of everybody in America today would say, yeah, I believe in a God. And actually, those 2/3 of those people, that they actually would say that they are religiously affiliated, that they have some religious connection. Now, the remaining third of people, majority of them are what is increasingly known as the nones, the N-O-N-E-S's, that they believe in something, they just don't know what it is. And really only about 10% or less of people would really say, hey, I don't believe in any God, or I'm not sure if there's a God. But all of those people, whether they say they believe in God, they say they believe in something, they say they're not sure what they believe, all of us worship things, don't we? All of us have something that we give our heart and our attention and our devotion and allow to direct our life. And so what are those things for us? And what we're going to find out is, just like in 8th century BC Samaria, that is kind of a mixing pot. That we a lot of times will give lip service to worshiping this as a culture, while we also allow these things to have our heart. And so I just want to share with you what I would see as probably the 3 big cultural idols that we have today. There's others we could talk about, but researchers would come back over and over again to these 3 things being defining cultural things that divide our attention and our worship. And the first of them is simply ourselves. You know, as I grew up and became a teenager, we added some channels to the 5 channels I had when I was a kid, and we got cable. It was amazing, right? And I really zeroed in on MTV because I love music, and I spent a ridiculous amount of time watching music videos as a teenager. And there's this one song by this skate punk band that I like that's called Institutionalized. And in this song, the lead singer talks about how his family, his parents, people who loved him kept coming to him and saying, hey Mike, I think there's something wrong with you. I think you maybe need to get some help. And as the story goes on, he says, they're coming and telling me that I need something, and what I keep telling them is all I really need is a Pepsi. And I think that's really funny, right? But it gets to this moment in the song where they come in, they have an intervention, and they say, we're going to get you some help. We think you have a really big problem. We think it's in your best interest. And listen to how he responds to that. He says, wait, what are you talking about? We decided this? My best interest? How do you know what my best interest is? What are you trying to say? You're trying to say I'm crazy? When I went to your schools, and I went to your churches, and I went to your institutional facilities? And right there it is. The cultural idol of individualism, where there is no other authority outside of right in here in myself. I'm the ultimate answer to what I need. And I don't think we'd have to think about it very long to realize that probably the greatest issue and idol in our society is personal choice and preference. Cultural researchist Gene Twenge says that as we look back over the past 100 years, there's progressively been a growing need to feel good about ourselves, that we need more encouragement to feel good about ourselves. And one of the things they've tracked is over the last about 70 years, they've looked at writings in America, and the prevalence of statements like, I love me, just be yourself, I'm special, took a sharp upturn about 1990, and has just exponentially went up. And so what that means is that today, we're about 4 times as likely as 30 years ago to hear people say those things. I love me, I'm special, I'm unique. And what that leads to eventually is saying, hey, you can't tell me my ideas are wrong because I'm special, and so therefore everybody's ideas should be equal and accepted. And so in our modern culture, the only sin is to call something sin because you can't tell other people what to do, right? That's that cultural idol of self. Now, looking back with older and maybe a little bit more mature eyes, I see the flaw in that song I liked as a teenager. Because as a parent, I know that, man, my heart breaks for my kids and I want what's best for them. And I know that's what those parents were doing for him as well. But I also realize that I'm still very impacted by wanting to be special and unique. And I really don't want people to tell me what to do either. We still are influenced by that cultural idol. The next cultural idol is that of sex. And what we'll see as we look at our culture's idols, it's much like those foreign gods of 8th century Samaria, in that they're interrelated. They're not isolated. They're connected. And so from that foundation of the idol of individualism and self springs that desire to do whatever feels good for me, particularly in my sexual activity. But as we look at the scripture, what we're going to see is that the truth of the Bible, and therefore what the one true God Yahweh believes, is that all sex outside of heterosexual marriage is sinful. There's so many places we could go where it points out that adultery, sex before marriage, cohabitation, pornography, friends with benefits, prostitution, polygamy, polyamory, bisexuality, and homosexuality are all said to not be the way God designed life to be. And we might all agree with some of the extreme examples of that, but I just want us to see that that culture, that idol of sex, has influenced all of us. It's impossible today to watch any sort of TV or movie or media that doesn't show a broken view of sex and relationships. And so how do we absorb that? How do we deal with that? How do we have conversations about that when we watch movies with characters that we care about and they end up falling in love and end up in bed together? How do we deal with that with characters who we find really interesting and engaging, and yet they make different choices about their sexual orientation than we would? And then what happens after we've done that, and then we come face to face with people that we genuinely know, real people that we love and care about, and they're making those choices? How do we deal with that? I was watching a movie the other day from the 1990s, and the main character was this heroic police officer, and his wife was the worst nagging gold digger you've ever met. She was a horrible person. And in the story, this police officer, has an interaction with this down on her luck waitress, and they kind of have some interactions together. And by the end of the movie, they spend the night together. Now, is that wrong? Yeah, for a married man to spend the night with another woman, that is wrong. But are you also, as you're watching this movie, kind of rooting for that guy? Also, yes, aren't we? Because what happens? Our hearts get involved. Our hearts get tied up, and suddenly my desires and my feelings can divide my devotion to what we know to be true, can't it? And then the last idol is that of stuff, which is a pretty generic word, but really I just need another S word, right? But also we do, aren't we connected to ourselves? How many of you would say you have too much stuff, right? How many of you, therefore, are also going to still go buy more stuff? Why do we do that, right? Our stuff controls us. It consumes us. We have to spend too much time and money and effort on it, don't we? We're famously in debt for all our stuff, and yet it's never enough. Again, social scientist Jane Twenge would say that our individualism has let us grow into a nation where we have an extended adolescence, where we just serve ourselves. And she measures that by this, is that we as every generation goes by, we do the adult milestones later and later in life. Getting married, having kids, buying a house, starting a career. And in that extended adolescence, you know what we do? We let the marketers of our nation tell us to buy more entertainment, fashion, social media, and all sorts of frivolous things. How many of us have ever made a frivolous purchase, right? Then you might have a problem with stuff. But in all of these idols, whether they're our modern idols or they're the ancient idols, what we're going to find out is that it's not just our problem right now, that this is a generational problem. If you read with me 2 Kings 17, verse 38, it says, "Do not forget the covenant that I made with you, says God. Do not fear other gods, but fear the Lord your God, and he will rescue you from all your enemies." And so again, here's the good news. If you've recognized today that you've got a divided heart, that you have divided interest, that your worship is divided, God says, just come back to me and I'll accept you. Come back to me and I'll forgive you. Come back to me and we'll fix this if you'll let me. Verse 40, "However, these nations would not listen but continued observing their former practices. They feared the Lord but also served their idols." Listen to this. "Still today their children and their grandchildren continue doing as their ancestors did. It's a generational problem. The problems we have today can be traced way back, but we could just simply go to the rebellions and the revolutions of the 60s and 70s of sex, drugs, and spirituality. We could add to that the consumerism of the 80s and the rejection of authority of the 90s when I was a kid, and it's all led us to this postmodern thought that everything's okay, but nothing's okay. So what do we do? Well, I think we have to start answering this question. Why would we let worthless things keep us from God's promises? Why would we let worthless things keep us from God's promises? If we know those things don't fill us up and they don't meet up, they're less, why would we turn to them? Paul, talking to the Galatian church, tells us this way, but in the past, since you didn't know God, you were enslaved to things that by nature are not God's. We used to follow those things. But now, since you know God, or rather have become known by God, isn't that good news? Not only do I know God, but God knows me. How can you turn back again to the weak and worthless elements? Do you want to be enslaved by them all over again? How do we avoid that? Let me just give us a few ideas today of how we can find a better guide to find us way out of this cultural pluralism that we live in. First step is to call sin, sin. The reality is that God wrote the book, He created the world, and therefore He gets to set the rules. And there's things that God says are wrong and fall short of His glory and that we should not do them. And maybe the worst of them is to forget His love and His mercy and His faithfulness to us. And so what do we do about that? Well, we get into His Word and we find out what He said. And that's why we challenge you to read the Bible every week. And again, if you want to engage with our reading plan, we've got those in the foyers, we've got those online, but we'd love for you to read the Bible and let it speak to you about what God has truly said. Secondly, we need to cling to convictions. Back there in 1 Kings 14 to Jeroboam, God said this, in order to anger me, you have proceeded to make for yourself other gods and cast images, but you flung me behind your back. When we put other things before God, we put Him on the back burner and say, God, I'm going to figure this out on my own. And God says, that's never going to work. So we've got to figure out, where do we need to stand firm? Theologian G.K. Chesterton put it this way. He says, tolerance is the virtue of the man without convictions. What is it that you need to cling to and stand on so that you can have conviction? But then once we've done that, we've called sin sin, and we see what we need to be convicted about, then we do this. We cry for mercy. In Psalm 18, it says, I called to the Lord in my distress, and I cried to God for help. From His temple He heard my voice, and my cry to Him reached His ears. Isn't that a great picture? When I realize the mess that I'm in and the problems I have, and I cry out to God, God hears from heaven, and He cares, and you know what His next step is? It's to step down and be with us. And that's exactly what He did when He sent Jesus to come and live among us and die on the cross to pay the debt for my mistakes and my divided heart. And that if I put my faith and trust in Him, that He would forgive me of those things and cleanse me from those things and set my feet on solid ground. Which leads to the last point, which is to create a new heart. The truth is, I can't reunite my divided heart, and neither can you. I can't put those pieces back together, but you know who can? The Lord can. God can, matter of fact, He can just give us a new heart. That's what He does for us. You know, King David probably gives us the best picture of this. David was a man after God's own heart, but yet he was also an adulterer and a murderer. And when he was faced with those sins, and he called those sins, and he realized the conviction of what had happened in his life, he cried out to God. And this is his response in Psalm 51. He says, be gracious to me, God, according to your faithful love, according to your abundant compassion, blot out my rebellion. Completely wash away my guilt and cleanse me from my sin, for I am conscious of my rebellion, and my sin is always before me. He acknowledged his mistakes. Against you, you alone, I have sinned and done this evil in your sight. So you are right when you pass sentence. You are blameless when you judge, like the Psalm 96 told us. Indeed, I was guilty. When I was born, I was sinful when my mother conceived me. Surely you desire integrity in the inner self, and you teach me wisdom deep within. Purify me with hyssop, and I will be clean. Wash me, and I will be whiter than snow. Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones you have crushed rejoice. Turn your face away from my sins and blot out all my guilt. And here it comes. God, create in me a clean heart. Renew a steadfast spirit within me. Don't banish me from your presence or take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore the joy of your salvation to me and sustain me by giving me a willing spirit. And then I will teach the rebellious your ways, and sinners will return to you. When divided, broken things turn to the Lord, he can reunite us and make us a people called for his name. But it starts today with us admitting that our hearts are divided, that the culture's influenced us, that we have things that divide our attention, and admitting that to God and asking him to forgive us and make us new. And then we will turn and find the one true God who's truly worthy of our worship. Would you guys stand with me?